question and who your question is for in the chat box. And if you want to comment on this workshop in social media, we invite you to do so using the hashtag Echidna Scholars. The goal of these workshops is to provide a space for a deep dive into the research of each of our 2022 Echidna Global Scholars. With the participation of both international and national experts, we hope to understand this research both as part of the broader conversation on this topic and with local contexts for policy and practice. In addition, we'll provide a space for all of you to meet, share, and learn with and from one another. And before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out to the Echidna Global Scholars Program and let you know a few details about the program if you don't know it yet. The Echidna Global Scholars Program started in 2012 and aims to strengthen the capacity of local leaders to drive evidence-based change and gender equality in and through education in the Global South and globally. After a rigorous selection process, the program begins with a 6-month fellowship at Brookings, during which time the scholars pursue individual research focused on improving learning opportunities and life outcomes for girls and young women across the Global South, develop their leadership and evidence-based policy skills, build substantive knowledge on gender and global education issues, and expand their impact competencies and pathways. And upon completion of the fellowship, the scholars transition to the Echidna Alumni Network, which is a growing and vibrant network of powerful leaders looking to have an impact, a collective influence on gender equality and education locally, regionally, and on the broader global education ecosystem. Since its inception in 2012, the program has hosted 11 cohorts of fellows. So this is our 11th cohort this year. And we serve an alumni network of 37 scholars from 21 different countries. I also want to take advantage of this moment to let you all know that we're currently recruiting for the 2023 cohort. So we've extended our deadline to receive applications through the end of the month. If you are or know of someone who's a mid-career professional working in gender equality and education looking to expand your impact, please consider applying. You can contact us at echidnaglobal@brookings.edu and we'll put that email in the chat for more information. And we will also put a link to the fellowship opening on the Brookings webpage in the chat as well. And now back to our workshop. Our agenda for this hour and a half is as follows. Echidna scholar Hina Salim will lead a brief group activity, and then she will present her key findings and recommendations from her research. A panel of experts will then respond to her research, and after this, we'll have an initial Q&A session with the panelists. We'll then move into a more interactive portion of the workshop and give you all the opportunity, excuse me, to participate in discussions and then return to share some of the highlights of our conversations and close out the workshop together. Thank you so much for taking this time to join us. We're really happy to have you here with us today. And now I have the honor of introducing Echidna scholar Hina Salim. Deeply interested in researching and designing contextualized gender responsive education programs informed by rural communities, Hina spearheaded the development and implementation of the Citizens Foundation's first community-led literacy and life skills program for out-of-school children in rural areas of Sindh, Pakistan. Prior to joining TCF, Hina conducted research on teacher training with the World Bank and the Global Partnership for Education, excuse me, and spent several years, I thought my voice would last till the end, but it didn't, and spent several years teaching in public schools with Teach for Pakistan. Hina has a master's in international education policy from Harvard and a master's in finance from the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi. And Hina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jen, for the kind introduction. To start us off, you'll see a poll on the screen. I want to know where everyone is joining us from. Please click on your region. And I'll share the results in a few minutes. Yeah, I'm also waiting for the results.
We're just waiting for a few more people to answer.
Okay, so we see an interesting mix of South Asia and North America with equal almost representation from there. Some from Asia Pacific, Latin America, and then East Africa. This is a good representation for now. And the next question that I have is what comes to your mind when you think about rural education in your context? If you can type your response in the chat, that'll help me to understand where everyone is with respect to the topic. So I'm seeing multi-grade classrooms, long walks, forgotten children and scarce resources, out-of-school children, lack of transportation, indigenous communities. Uh, yes, and this leads us to the topic itself. And some of these issues will be covered in today's presentation. Keep the responses coming while I share the screen. So in today's presentation, I'll talk about some of the findings from the policy recommendations, of some of the findings from the policy brief that I worked with over this fellowship. And from the policy brief, I'll be sharing some research findings, some dominant trends, and then end with next steps. This work builds on the research that I conducted as part of this fellowship, and also builds on the 3 years of work that I did as part of my work with Citizens Foundation, where I focused on rural Pakistan. When we talk about Pakistan and education in the global space, usually issues like violence against girls to stop them from going to school, or role of madrasas are the topics that get more attention. Today, however, I want to talk about issues that are more systemic, deep-rooted, and have existed over a long arc. Universal primary education had been targeted since the 1970s in Pakistan, but here we are where we're still very far from the target. When we look at primary completion rates for different provinces, we see, for instance, in Punjab, they're moving up. In KP, which is in orange, again, they're moving, KP, which is in red, that's also moving up. Balochistan, we see that it's going down. In Sindh, we see that they're stagnant. And this brings us to the question, why are children in Pakistan not completing education, and are they being pushed out of the system, or are they not being able to get enrolled in schools? Here we see 3 dominant trends. 80% of the children who are not in schools in Pakistan have never enrolled in schools. So of the 20 million children, the dominant trend is that of those, 80% have never enrolled in a school. 77% are those who are from rural parts of Pakistan, and half of the children who are in school in grade 5 are much below grade level. They cannot read a story, they cannot solve division questions, and these are some of the learning outcomes that have been tested. There are many others that have not been tested. For the purpose of this work, I focused on the province of Sindh, and I did that for a couple of reasons. Sindh is the second most populated province in Pakistan, and moving the needle on Sindh will make a difference for the entire country. The second thing is that within Sindh, we see that there is a huge difference between urban and rural participation rates, and the gap is the widest compared to other provinces. And the more important thing that we see within that is that the participation rates for girls in rural areas are the lowest compared to other places in Pakistan. Now let's look at who are the most underserved children in Pakistan. When you look at a boy who is in an urban part of Sindh, between the age of 5 to 16 years, he is more likely to be in school compared to a girl in rural Sindh. And if you look at it, only 3 out of 10 girls in rural Sindh are currently in schools. So, and then when we look at it from an income perspective, we see that if you're a boy or a girl in the richest quintile, then you are very likely to be in school compared to if you're in the poorest quintile. And there again, we see that girls are the most marginalized. 2 out of 10 girls are in schools from the poorest quintile. We don't have the data, unfortunately, we don't have the data, the intersectional data, but we can infer from both the graphs that if you're a girl belonging to a low income family and live in rural areas, you're less likely to be in school. The research questions that we looked at were, how can policy respond to lived realities of underserved children to meet education needs? And then to answer that, looked at what are the needs and aspirations of children, how do current policies in SIND respond to those. As I undertaken this work, and this is my 4th year, I often get this response from people that you're looking at the most marginalized. The government data suggests otherwise. When we look at census data from 2017, we see that within rural Sindh, there are 4 million children who have never entered in a classroom. And to me, this is not a problem of that exists only at the margins. It is the heart of the problem it's the heart of the problem in education in rural Sindh. Before diving into findings, I want to talk about the methodology and the research methods that we used. And with this, I want to clarify that I'm from Karachi, which is an urban center in Sindh, predominantly an urban center in Sindh. And to understand the context better, I worked with a research assistant, Rubaya Nizamani, who has strong ties with rural Sindh, speaks the language fluently, and has worked in different parts of Sindh before doing this work. And both of us together visited 4 districts in Sindh, not to, so we don't generalize findings from one district to another. That's why we focused on this spread. As we worked through this, and you can see we covered 8 settlements, the location pins indicate those. And let me take you through what a settlement looks like. These 2 location pins indicate a settlement. The settlements that we covered had populations ranging from 300 to 5,000 people. And these settlements are usually not connected to the main road. When a girl reaches puberty, her unchaperoned mobility outside of the settlement becomes difficult. And men from outside also cannot enter these settlements. So, and this has repercussions for access to schools, and then thinking about male teachers and female teachers, and I'll discuss that later. The research methodology, the research methods that we used were a mix of visual-based activities and and focus group discussions and interviews. For the visual-based activities, we took visuals representing different parts of schools. For instance, building, what the learning activities look like in the classroom, what teacher actions look like. And based on that, we shared those visuals with mothers, fathers, and children, and they designed an ideal school in separate groups. We took the visuals because in our previous interaction with mothers, there was always hesitation in participating in those discussions because they would confess that they hadn't visited classrooms, and that makes it difficult for them to express views on this. This really facilitated the discussion for us and helped us to see what children would choose when they become decision makers in this process. And usually we go to communities to ask them about problems. This helped us to see what communities thought of as solutions also. So for instance, in one case, we asked them if a female teacher is not available to teach their older girls, what should the government do? Their response was that if a male member of the same settlement teaches their older girls, they're fine with that. So that gave us an idea of that the alternatives can also come from the settlements. So this is what this is the summary of the ideal school that was designed by parents and children. And as there is marked there that children were interested in more play-based activities and less vigilance from teachers. When we compare this ideal school with what exists in the local settlement, the school that exists, we see that most often those requirements are not met. And these requirements are basic, they're not rocket science. Before I delve into each of these findings separately, I want to set the stage by talking about the aspirations that parents have from education. So not surprisingly, families value education both for their sons and daughters. They want their kids to study, but their aspirations are not met. The second thing that we saw was that there are gendered aspirations. So for instance, less years of schooling are expected for the daughter versus the boy, for the son. And then the other thing that we noticed was that for sons, it is expected that they will do jobs and go outside of the settlement. And for girls, it is expected that education will bring more improvement in their home environments. So those outcomes are different, but the education importance is definitely there. Now, how do these gendered aspirations determine the present or what the decision of parents in enrolling the child in primary school? So what we see is that the future possibility of schooling and the aspirations from it determines the present also. So for instance, the settlements, the 8 settlements we visited, half of those had non-functional schools. The building was there, but the classes weren't running. The other half had the school building, classes were happening, but they were all overcrowded. And when there is overcrowding and parents have to choose between sending their son or daughter, then they choose their son. And as this goes, and this issue is really huge in rural Sindh and generally with public sector in Sindh, because when we look at the overall data, we see that more than 3/4 of the public schools in Sindh, primary public schools in Sindh, are 2 rooms or less. So which means that overcrowding is something that parents experience, and then those decisions are making. When children are sent to a school outside of the settlement, then there is the cost increases, the safety concerns increase, and again, those choices are made between sons and daughters. When the children get to school, if they get to school, both the data and parents' reports of their experiences and what they hear from others is that of exclusion. When we look at the data, we see that in Sindh, 2 out of 5 children are only able to read a story when they get to grade 5 in rural Sindh. And when we hear about the perceptions of parents, they do not see their children learning in a room with children from other 5 grades. So multi-grades is something that parents perceive as a problem, even though multi-grade teaching has been found effective in other contexts or other parts of the world. The second experience of exclusion that parents report is that when there is overcrowding, they feel that children from a certain caste or kin are given more preference. This goes back to the need for providing support to teachers and giving them the tools to work with these perceptions. The third important finding that we saw as part of our work was that education system, both in its absence and presence, alienates communities. When we ask parents about their aspirations from education, they list number of professions, but they don't list livestock management, farming, where they have the local knowledge, where they have the resources and children can work on those things. They see education as a departure point from those professions. I mean, one is that there is upward social mobility, but the other is that they don't see education rewarding those professions or knowledge associated with those professions. And that begs the question that who has this education system been created for and who does it benefit? Lastly, I want to talk about poverty, and in Sindh, because of the 4 districts that we visited as part of this research, we saw different shades of poverty and how it affected the communities differently. Overall, I think I'll just say at this point is that it affects obviously the nutrition and health indicators of children, but it also has gendered effects. Girls as young as 6-year-old are pulled into childcare and household responsibilities. As most of us are aware that Pakistan went through massive floods in August 2022 and is still suffering from the effects of it. That has worsened the poverty indicators. And when we met with one of the communities as part of this research, they were still talking about the floods that happened 12 years ago. So this will continue to have long-lasting effects. And this poverty will affect enrollment, continuation, and retention of kids in school. And as we see right now also, that learning of 1.7 million children in rural Sindh, has been affected by the recent floods. I'll talk about recommendations, and that will bring us towards the end of this session. The first is to design more inclusive education and services. And to be able to do that, we need to think about what can we do about contextualization within the rural context. There is good amount of reading material available for literacy that aligns with or gives some good examples for working with the rural context, but that contextualization is missing at the other subjects, for instance, math or other subjects. So we need to think about how do we bring that into it? How do we think about gender responsive teaching within that? How do we represent boys and girls as opposed to the gender norms that prevail in the society? We need to improve working conditions for female teachers and then involve women as part of decision making, more women as part of decision making and community facing services. Once the focus on the design is done, there is important that to improve implementation, there is focus on teacher training, more for support and motivation also. And we need to prepare both male and female teachers for gender responsive, contextualized teaching. And a lot of times, female teachers are used as a policy lever to increase girls' enrollment. What needs to be understood is that supply of female teachers in rural Sindh is very limited. If we look at the adult female literacy in rural Sindh, it's just 20%. And secondary completion rates are much lower. So you will not always have female teachers. So then how can you work with male teachers to bring in those practices is very important. And then thinking about multi-grade teaching, because it's a reality of the system. So how do we provide that support to teachers? There is, within the training module, there is a section on multi-grade. But in terms of learning materials and whether it's effective in classrooms, that still has to be seen. And lastly, sorry, this is the third one. Okay, within this, we have to resolve for access holistically. When you talk about education right now in Sindh, the move is towards bigger schools. When we talk about bigger schools, the infrastructure becomes really important, because then you're saying is that the school may no longer be within the settlement, it will be outside the settlement, so that it becomes a school for greater number of settlements. But then how do children from each settlement access that school is a question mark, because the roads are not there. The roads are difficult to cross. Then there is non-availability of free transportation to go to school. And if these bottlenecks exist and are not being resolved, then bigger schools can become exclusionary spaces. So we have to resolve for it holistically. And then for poverty, we need to engage with welfare services. We need to address the effects of poverty at the school level. For instance, think about in-school feeding programs. Those in-school feeding programs, research tells us, are very effective for enrollment and improvement of learning outcomes. Cash transfers are already in place in Pakistan, and those are linked to enrollment also. But we need to understand to what extent they are effective in improving enrollment in rural populations. With this, I would conclude the presentation. I hope this was helpful in understanding some of the dominant trends. And it was useful in understanding some of the next steps that we are looking at. Back to you, Jen.
Thank you, Hina. Thank you so much for that really insightful look into the context, the processes, the dynamics, and the nuances of education, rural education in Sindh, and for sharing your deep knowledge. You can tell that you are deeply connected to the communities, and we appreciate you bringing that to this conversation. I just want to remind people again, I see there's at least one question in the chat there. So please do go ahead and type your question and who your question is for in the chat box as we continue the conversation today. And I would now like to invite our first panelist, Dr. Karen Groen, to join us on screen.
Hi, good.
Hi, Karen.
Hello, everybody, wherever you are. Thanks so much for inviting me. First of all, I'd like to really...
Hi, Karen. I'm going to briefly introduce you so everyone who doesn't know you yet gets to hear about all of your many experiences. Karen is a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings and an internationally recognized expert on gender issues and development, having served as Global Director for Gender at the World Bank, economist in residence and co-director of the Program on Gender Analysis in Economics at American University, Senior Gender Advisor at USAID, Senior Scholar and co-director of the Gender Equality and the Economy Program at the Levy Economics Institute, and Director of the Poverty Reduction and Economic Governance Team at the International Center for Research on Women. Karen has published widely on issues of gender equality and development, taxation, trade, health, and women's empowerment, and was a founding member of Data 2X and the International Working Group on Gender and Macroeconomics. She has developed and co-led several large-scale research projects, including the UNU wider program on aid effectiveness and gender equality. She holds doctoral and master's degrees in economics from the New School for Social Research. Karen, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today. Given your own extensive work, which I summarized briefly there for everyone, could you help us situate Hina's research within the broader global conversation around policy design and implementation for children, and especially girls who are currently not being reached by school? Now over to you, sorry.
Thank you so much, Jen, and it's a great delight to be here with everyone. I'd like to first compliment Hina on her work. I think you've done a really fantastic piece of work, and I really like the qualitative approach that complements a lot of the quantitative data. And I was particularly struck, I think, Hina, I really love the exercise that you did with the parents in the community on what the ideal school looks like. And I think that's really fantastic as a mode of engagement. And I really think it's really important to continue to keep parents involved. And I just wonder going forward, I didn't, see as much. I wonder what your ideas are for continuing their engagement. So one thing that I know has worked in other contexts is the idea of report cards, for school report cards that parents actually get information on and can see the extent to which their kids are being served in different ways. Report cards sometimes have parental input. It becomes a shared opportunity, and I'm just curious about something like that. I have another question for you, and then I'm going to go and go ahead and answer Jen's question about some of the broader context. But, it's interesting to me that Sindh is different than Punjab and KP. And I'm wondering why the trends are downward for Sindh, and what about Punjab and KP? It makes them a little bit more successful at increasing access. So is it something, I don't think it's the case, but is it something about being less rural and more urbanized? Is it something about income level? Is it something about economic structure? I'd love to hear a little bit more of your thoughts about that. On the broader, I think your research has shown a few things that really echo the findings from the broader context. And I'm sure everybody who's in this chat knows there's some really wonderful summaries that have just come out, meta evaluations on the literature of what works for girls' education. And I just wanted to refer to work by David Evans at CGD, as well as a new meta study by Jen Psaki for the Campbell Collective that have summarized all of the random control trials, both on girl-targeted interventions as well as more general interventions for increasing both outcomes in terms of completion outcomes, as well as learning outcomes. And it was interesting to me that this came last. I don't necessarily think that you meant it to come last, but the access issues in terms of the financial constraints seem to be very, very important in the general literature. And you've mentioned, how do you reduce the cost of schooling? And here I am really interested in hearing more about the BISP. This is the Benazir Income Support Program, which is the cash transfer program, and how that is used to incentivize parents' desires to fulfill their aspirations to get girls into school. I think BISP has been shown to be effective in a number of domains in Pakistan, but it would be interesting I don't know if there's any quantitative work that looks at BISP and girls' outcomes. You didn't say too much about this, but I think water and sanitation facilities is really important for girls, especially at the secondary level, and menstrual hygiene management, both in terms of the infrastructure, but also in terms of the education for teachers on this and reducing stigma, which is important at the secondary level. And in addition to the BISP, there might be other forms of subsidies. There was an earlier, I'm sure you know this, an earlier random control trial that looked at subsidies for private schools, which was seen to be quite effective. But I have the sense that there's probably not. I'm interested in the distribution, and perhaps you can say about this, between public schools versus private schools in Sindh, and are they complementary? What does their kind of coverage look like? It's really great. So those are on the financial side. I think it's really great that you also highlight the issues of mobility and in this context, and just a few comments on this. I mean, I think we know from the bigger literature that, of course, female teachers as role models and other things is really important. But given what you just said, I really think maybe we need to target male teachers from within the settlements. I think I like the idea, in some sense, of bigger schools and bigger infrastructure, but it's outside the settlements. So how do we nurture a gender equitable or a gender aware mindset of the men in the settlements in terms of their teaching methods and their teaching approaches? They're trusted by parents. So I think this is something, and maybe there's as much value in that as there is in terms of the recruitment of female teachers. And I think male teachers can be highly effective in terms of norms change more generally, not just in terms of teaching girls. There's lots of interesting things I think about the infrastructure issues and the transportation mobility. And I get, distance clearly is really, really important, thinking about how you deal with the transportation at the same time. And here, maybe there are some girl targeted interventions, but just some of the generic interventions in terms of infrastructure. And I don't have a sense of what the larger infrastructure plans are for these settlements. For instance, just generic building of roads or reconversion of different kinds of other infrastructure that could be converted to schools. And once the infrastructure is there, when you think about the transportation, lots of things have been tried in terms of bicycle experiences, in terms of mobile buses, all those kinds of things that would be interesting for you to just like to hear what you think speculating would work in this particular context. I'm a little skeptical, particularly at the elementary level, but, or the primary level, but maybe at the secondary level, these larger school things, but that is where you get to the norms issue that you really do need to solve. The other, and some other final comments that I think are really important. I think, education is generally, the access is generally constrained. It's higher for girls than for boys, but we can't forget boys. And one interesting finding from the research literature is in areas where you have solved kind of the male access problem, the girls' access improves as well. So I really think it's important to focus on how we help both boys as well as girls, with a special lens on girls, but boys also have to have better access and better learning outcomes. And finally, I think ultimately we need to think about economic development of rural areas. and how education is linked to the growth of different types of employment and labor force outcomes. And of course, it was interesting to me, if you don't have active labor markets, of course, people think about their employment roles quite differently. You have social media, you have television, you have marketing, so you can see alternatives. But if you don't have it there and people that are going into the different types of employment, it's hard to see where education leads. So it's really important, I think, at the municipal level to think about more of an integrated approach for employment diversification, employment creation, employment diversification, along with what you're doing within the school system. So let me stop there and again, congratulate you, Hina, on a really rich study and set of findings, and we'll look forward to hearing how this is going to influence the SIND approach to education going forward. Back to you, Jen.
Great. Thank you, Karen, so much. I was rapidly trying to take notes here, as there are many topics I think that we can continue the conversation on those. But first, I would like to invite our second panelist today, Mr. Salman Naveed Khan, to join us on screen. Salman is currently the CEO and founder of PAC Alliance for Math and Science, where he is leading efforts to inform and advocate for learning experiences that aligns with interests of Pakistani students from a perspective of policy reform and practice. Previously, Salman was heading policy and political engagement at Alif Islan, which launched a massive advocacy campaign to highlight issues in education in Pakistan at the provincial and district level. An important facet of this campaign was 25 million broken promises, which was instrumental in highlighting the issue of out-of-school children in Pakistan. Salman has a master's degree in public policy from SOAS, University of London, and is currently pursuing a master's in public policy. Salman, thank you so much again for being with us today. We really look forward to learning from your experience and deep knowledge of education policy and practice within Pakistan, and your focus on out-of-school children in particular. Can you help us to understand how Hina's research might fit into the local context in Pakistan? So what are some of the opportunities and challenges that you see, for example, within SIND towards uptake of some of her proposals?
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and thank you so much, Hina, for the amazing work that you've done, and hope to see the final set of recommendations that go to the state on this, and for pushing some of them through, definitely. I think the most impressive part of the work that you've done is sticking to the proverb of "it takes a village." I think the fact that the key focus on recommendations of involvement of communities and the work that they can do in ensuring that education provision, the way that it is required from a supply side perspective, and the challenges that are there pertinent to that village or that town or that community are addressed in a way that helps both boys and girls get into school and stay there and ensure that they learn. I think to answer your question, and also to take a departure from the question itself, I think one of the challenges that SIND has faced of late is that there's an increasing class divide between the teachers who are permanent state employees and the children who attend those schools in the first place. The children who attend, as Hina's research also shows, the ones who aren't in school are in the poorest quintile, but even the ones who are in school in a large part of rural Sindh are the ones who are from the poorest or the poorer quintiles. But a state employee who becomes a government school teacher or a state school teacher, there's a significant difference between the parents of that community and that person in the first place. So that lack of connectivity and lack of empathy, unfortunately, results in a number of challenges that both the communities face as well as the education managers face, which discourages enrollment and continuation by the children. Even in the case of very high enrollment schools, and this is what the data also shows us, that we've seen a very, very poor percentage of boys and girls who actually attend school every day. So maybe I think a focus on attendance and what it results in terms of putting more and more kids at risk of dropping out of the system and not learning in the first place. On inclusivity, I think it's an important part, and the visual research methodology that you've used is, I think it's great to see it being put into practice, to understand what children want, and also to see what a girl child needs. So both aspects need to be addressed. And going back to the recommendations that you've made, I think these answers cannot be provided by the state unless there is a connect between the communities, or the involvement, or without the lack of, without involvement of communities in the first place. Because the one challenge that, an interesting insight that you brought of parents seeing education as a way of not just social mobility, but also mobility from the traditional employment opportunities that exist in rural parts of Sindh. For example, linked to agriculture, or any irrigation related or agriculture related activity. Because communities see education as a way of largely seeking state employment. And this is not just particular to Sindh, but also to other rural parts of Pakistan, where the state has been the largest employment agency in the past, which is not the case anymore. The state's own capacity to hire people on a permanent government scale has reduced significantly, which puts actually more kids at risk in Sindh. Communities now who see value in education because their child, boy, in all probability, will get a state job, will see that hope dwindling in the decades to come. And once that starts to happen, we're putting more and more people at risk because we're not giving them an opportunity to understand what education can do for them and their communities, instead of only seeking state employment. So that's, I think, possibly an area to explore. But this, in terms of the recommendations, I think the most important one that should get pushed through, and we'll definitely help in any way that we can, is understanding of the needs of a girl child, not at a macro level, but purely from a design thinking perspective of building personas and the way that this research has been conducted, and making sure that the education managers and the decision makers understand what Mina, who lives in a village an hour and a half away from Sakkar city, needs, and what her needs are what need to be addressed, not what the supply side system already provides. I think it's interesting that this comes at a time that's also politically relevant for a country like Pakistan, with us entering into another election cycle next year, and a new government or set of governments coming into power, which will allow, hopefully, these set of recommendations being taken more seriously by people who've just assumed office. So I'm excited about the opportunities that this research creates, and I'm hoping that that the research in itself and the rich product that we'll get will hopefully spur conversations, not just at the policy level, but also in terms of the actions that we undertake as Pakistanis or as people interested in education of our children in Sindh. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Salman. It's really, I think, helpful to frame this conversation too, in light of some of those sort of local pieces that you talk about. And I'm thinking through, we have a number of questions in the chat. Sorry, I'd first like to invite all of our panelists, Hina, Karen, to also join me on screen. And we will, and Salman as well, if you can turn on your video, that would be great. We'll have some time to do some questions and answers with some of the questions that we have in the chat here. So we have several. I wanted Hina just very quickly, because there was a question around the age group that you were focusing on. So maybe just to if you want to sort of clarify where you were focusing, because there are different issues that happen at different points in the educational trajectory and in the life trajectory. So maybe you want to just help us to situate that quickly.
Yes, and I should have clarified that as part of the presentation. I was focusing on 5 to 7 year olds. And the reason was that we see that when we look at out of school children, in Sindh, we see that around 50% are in the 5 to 9 bracket and the remaining are in the 10 to 16 bracket. And we also see delayed enrollments. And when delayed enrollments happen, the maximum school participation is reached at age 9. And after that, it starts tapering off. So then thinking about how can we get children in school on time was one of the questions that we did work with as part of this research.
Great, thank you, Hina. I want to return to something Salman was saying, and Hina, that you've been saying throughout your research, but this point around sort of how do we understand and design from the needs and the perspectives of girls and their families, and sort of with this lack of empathy that might exist in government officials or public officials, those who are, in charge of designing and implementing policy. And I think one of the things, Hina, that came out of your research that was really interesting and is a good reminder for all of us who work in policy is that it doesn't matter if the classroom is overcrowded or not. What matters is if the parents think the classroom is overcrowded and are therefore not sending their children to school, right? It doesn't matter if the teaching practice is exclusive. I mean, it does matter, sorry. What matters really is that parents think it is, right? And so how do you work not to say to parents, oh, it's really, the teaching practice is really inclusive, but really to engage communities in such a way that communities and teachers and public officials together can come to a common and shared understanding of what's happening. So I was wondering maybe if you could start from that place around, again, linking to what you found, but especially thinking about recommendations and how we can move forward to design policy in such a way that we do develop these sort of shared understandings and empathy, among all of the actors that are involved.
Yes, I think I would answer it in 2 parts. One, I will start off with changing perceptions of parents. As part of this research, when Rubaiya Nizamani and I would go in the field and Rubaiya would work with the kids while I'll be in the background, you could always see the joy and pride in parents' eyes as they would see their children engaging in those activities. And when they would do that, almost a lot of times they would ask me if Rubaiya could stay in that settlement, or they would make that request if Rubaiya could stay back and teach their kids. So I feel like parents' perceptions of how things change, they see it when the kids participate. There's obviously know when the kids are learning and they're not. And sometimes we don't give them enough credit. So, and those perceptions then can be, that process of changing those perceptions can be built into enrollment drives. So for instance, when we met with parents in rural Sindh, most of them did not know their ages of their children. And when we asked them what's the right age to enroll a child, they all had their own understanding of it. Maybe when the child is 5, maybe when the child is 7, maybe we need to send girls earlier because they cannot study for as many years. And to me, that begs the question, why are enrollment drives not happening or not as effective? And then when we do enrollment drives, we make women part of it, so that when they enter settlements, they are able to conduct those activities with parents where they see that when their child is part of a group and is learning, then that can translate within the school also. So I think these are some of the things that can happen. But having said that, even when we assess needs at the local level, at the village level, the bottleneck remains are the local governments there to contextualize, to drive or manage that implementation. And I think that's a really important question in the context of Sindh. And even when they're set up, the delegation, the authority that they have, I think those are some of the areas that I often think about.
Great, thank you. Salman, is there anything that you've found in your work in particular on this piece around sort of involving and engaging communities in policy design, in policy implementation that has sort of address this issue of the disconnect between the perceptions of families and the education system?
So Hina hit the nail on the head. I think that the lack of local government or the presence of effective local governments in the first place creates a significant disconnect between parents' needs or the child needs and what decision makers in Karachi or the provincial capital decide how a school needs to be built. So whether it's a shack that's in the community that can work as a school, as a multi-grade school, or whether it's a building that is needed with 6 rooms and 6 teachers, these are decisions that ideally should be parked with decision makers at the local level. Unfortunately, within the education bureaucracy or the system that exists now, in the absence of a very, very effective local government system, that disconnect has always been a challenge, and it's becoming more so with more of a focus on urban centers as opposed to the rural parts of the province, where the people like myself with agency reside in bigger cities, have a voice, have access to policymakers, and can also help influence decisions. But the people who are based in those rural communities, unfortunately, don't have that agency necessarily.
Okay, thank you. Karen, I want to turn to you because I know that we have you for only about 7 more minutes. And we had several questions in the chat around sort of the connection with employment and this dichotomy between the aspirations of parents and saying they want their children to have education, but then not being enrolled. And is that linked in part to the employment opportunities? So I just wanted to sort of turn that question over to you in term, and also, sorry, I'm going to speak for you really quickly, Hina, and let you come back after Karen to talk about this a bit more. But one thing Hina has found too, right, is, and many and others is, you know, with employment opportunities, with more education, people often leave rural communities because the employment opportunities are outside of that. So I'm just going to try to think of like, what is the actual question, but is a reflection on sort of how can we work and think about sort of the employment piece related to this and employment that doesn't pull, kids out of communities, but that could be seen as something that incentivizes parents to enroll their children, and especially their girls, in school.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks again, Hina. I really love the way this conversation is going, and I hope you'll also get the chance to talk a little bit about how Sindh is different than some of the other provinces. On the employment question, I think it's important to be a little bit forward thinking. I mean, Salman mentioned this, and I think Hina alluded to it. I think the growth of the agricultural sector is really, really important, but there's a variety of different ways to think about agricultural growth or modernization, if you will. And women do participate in agriculture, but there's a variety of things to be thought about in terms of processing. There's specific kinds of supply chains that we can think about, which might have some interesting opportunities for women or not. I really think, when I think about the South Asia region, and I think about what's happening in countries like India and Bangladesh, there's the movement of cooperatives in important sectors, for instance, and women are really important in terms of cooperatives. That makes you think through the access to finance issues. It makes you think about the consumer end of it and so forth. I think that there's also a promise, and Pakistan is doing this, in terms of digitalization and new technology. And I think the ICT sector is something that is important for rural populations. Of course, you need the broadband, you need the cable, you need the access. We know that women have less digital literacy than men. But I think even if provided that girls have access to the technology, this is also a big issue. Girls having access to the technology and being able to, if there's the STEM education, 2 different issues, the access to the technology, whether it's the phone or the one computer in the household or a center that they could go and access. We have to think specifically about that. But I think that's important in terms of the future careers, and you can do a lot more in that sector. And I think Pakistan is already moving there. One of the things that I think is also really interesting is this issue of, female entrepreneurship is growing in Pakistan. In Karachi alone, there's these really interesting experiments with entrepreneurship. These female entrepreneurs can be tapped, some, I think, in different ways, to work in more rural areas and to become more of the role models and also help with the after school, if you will, after school kind of robotics and ICT kind of experimentation. So I think that's interesting. And I don't know what you think about that, Hina. Be interested to hear.
I think with, I'll respond to that, but to the broader question, I think the employment opportunities, I think skills is highlighted as an area by parents. And when it comes to skills, there's a lot of arts and crafts that have been retained in Sindh, and Sindh has a rich history of producing those. Unfortunately, the labor of women that goes into it is not as well rewarded. So those constraints remain, but those are things that can be brought back. And I think there is a local market for it. There is an export market for it. So those are some of the things that one can think about as they think about economic opportunities. With the technology piece, again, with technology, even giving access to women to a mobile phone is still not a very common practice. Men will get that access. So I think that again has to work around the norms. And one will have to think about that as we think about ICT. But I think there's a huge potential for skills. And that can come at you don't have to do all years of schooling if you don't want to do that. You can get into skills much earlier, but there has to be a concrete strategy linked to economic opportunity. You don't want to train kids for skills that will not be rewarded. So I think that's important. On the provinces piece, and if Salman would want to talk about employment, he can. But if on the provinces piece, I would definitely want Salman to respond to that.
Great. Sorry, Salman. I'm going to quickly just jump in and thank Karen again. I know she has another commitment at 9:30 Eastern time. So Karen, thank you so much for joining us. And we know we will continue the conversation as we have you here at Brookings with us. So have a good day. Thank you. Sorry, Salman, please go ahead.
Thank you, Hina. So I think Sindh or the disparities across provinces have been around for some time now. The context of Sindh, or to understand how education services delivery happens, and this is not for Pakistan, or this is not for Sindh, but education pretty much is a very, very core political economy challenge anywhere in the world. In Sindh, unfortunately, the political economy for education is not aligned with rural folks benefiting. It's about ensuring that the status quo is maintained. This is not a political comment or against or for a particular ideology, but the challenge has been largely because, and in the case of Balochistan, we've seen that for segmented populations or sparse populated areas, relatively speaking, again, the state's access or the state supply chain has failed repeatedly. You will find in the areas that Hina's mentioned in her research, where you don't find schools, you will find small shops which serve bottled Nestle water. So the supply chain for Nestle is there, and they'll make sure that even for the poorest of the poor who can't afford a 30 rupee bottle of water, but a bottle of water will be there for people who can afford. But the state has been unable to really latch on to that supply chain and pull it off the way that other provinces actually have taken advantage of. So in the case of, for example, Punjab, or at least a large part of the province, we've seen social mobility and economics playing a significant push in making sure that people educate their children. They see more employment opportunities for their daughters and for their sons because they've seen success stories around them. Um, and and this is something that worked in the Punjab in the 60s and 70s, where there was a push for creating success in every village. So you find is someone completing 10 years of education, going on to get a job, and becomes sort of, I want to be that person for every parent. So that person, that man or woman, became the ultimate cousin that your parents would always point towards and say that, that's the person that we want you to become. Sindh, unfortunately, hasn't been able to catch up to that trend because of various political/social reasons. But unless and until we create those successes through strong affirmative action, through taking kids out from those communities, at least some of them, putting them in big urban centers, funding their education, making them sure that they get to fly planes, and we showcase them, it's very difficult for communities to come out and demand the level of supply that they actually need. They didn't ask for bottled water from Nestle, but they got it. So now they need to speak for their children's rights also. So we need to give them that level of agency with some success on how they should go about it.
Great, thank you, Salman. I wish we had like 2 more hours to talk about that. Hina, is there anything you would like to? I think we're going to move. We have some questions around teachers, but we wanted to give people an opportunity to also share their own experiences in some smaller groups. So, Hina, I wanted to see if there was anything, sort of last thoughts you wanted to add in here before we move into those smaller groups.
Yeah, so last 2 points. On the differences between provinces and thinking about school report cards, that is something that has worked in Punjab. And it has worked in Punjab because the settlement size is larger in Punjab. And in one settlement, you could have 10 schools. So then there is competition and parents have those choices. In Sindh, parents don't have those choices. So school report card may not work. The other thing is the public and the private schooling. In Sindh itself, when we look at urban areas from a 2014 report, 67% children were going in private schools in an urban area, but in rural Sindh, only 16% kids. So rural children are relying on public schooling provision unless there is much higher incentive created for private sector schools to work in those areas.
Thank you both again so much for this conversation and for sharing, your own work and experiences. We've had a number of really great comments in the chat that I encourage both of you and everyone to take a look at. And just this really complex and very nuanced conversation that needs to be had around, how do we really listen to, involve, and respond to effectively rural children and their families. So I want us to move now to give people an opportunity to move into breakout rooms. We've had some questions in the chat around teachers and especially teacher training, and both Hina and I think Karen talked about the role of male teachers as well, and the need to include men generally and male teachers in particular in this conversation and in this work to really bring about, to really respond to the needs again of rural children. So please bring that conversation on teachers. I'm sure we have many people in this conversation today who have experience of working with teachers. We also, have some guiding questions around sort of things that resonated with you or surprised you about Hina's research. And then policy solutions that you would recommend for the inclusion of girls living in poverty in rural communities, and just to understand what has worked in your context. So please, I think the breakout rooms should be coming up soon. And we will come back together in about 18 minutes. So we will see you soon. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope that the departure or the closing of the breakout rooms was not too abrupt, and apologies to whoever was left in the middle of something that their important point that they wanted to make, but would now love to use this space to hear back from the breakout rooms about the conversations. And so thought we could start maybe with breakout room 3. Do we know who was the facilitator of that room, or do we have a reporter for breakout room 3? I think Anthony and Atenea, you were in that room.
Yeah, thank you. I was the facilitator in that room, and we were lucky to have Mohamed Adil, who is also from the region that Hina is covering. So he was our reporter, and Adil, welcome. You can share on our deliberations. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Adil. I'm doing my master's right now at Harvard, and I'm exactly from the same context that Hina's from, Karachi, Sindh. So the first question that was discussed was the significance and importance of teachers in rural or areas with marginalized communities. And some of the responses revolved around the need for respect and empathy between students and teachers to allow for much more engaged students. How teachers are an extremely important buffer between a child being in school or out of school. And one response revolved around teachers from within the communities is quite helpful, for they have nuanced contextual knowledge, and they can provide that cultural pertinence to students. Then there was also discussion of COVID and how during COVID teachers played such an important role by being in touch with students, families, and communities to ensure that they were engaged. The second question was around what we resonate with regards to Hina's presentation and anything that surprised us. One major thread that came out was that oftentimes in academic and policy circles, even in political circles, there's a stereotype that's peddled that parents or rural communities are to blame for the children not being educated, especially girls. Hina's presentation really nicely debunked that. It is not actually, parents actually want their children, especially girls, to be educated. It's more of the state's responsibility and the social economic constraints they face. And the last important insight was around how the school can be a highly exclusionary space when it's there by prioritizing specific castes, languages, or classes. And it can also be highly exclusionary by its very absence as well. So in its presence and absence, it can serve as an exclusionary space. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that piece that you mentioned there towards the end around sort of the debunking of stereotypes and the interrupting of some of those narratives that we often hear around how it's the parents, right? The parents don't want their children to be in school, and their girls especially. And I agree with you that one of the strengths of Hina's work is to debunk that stereotype and sort of break that narrative. And as you mentioned as well, and as you all talked about, this piece around the exclusionary space, both in its presence and its absence, and how do we think through that, and teachers as an important role in that. Sorry, I don't need to repeat back everything you said. I got overexcited. Then would love to move on to group number 2. Bhavana, I think you were facilitating in this group. Do you have someone who's going to report back to us about your conversation?
Yes, Claudio was generous enough to be our reporter. So Claudia.
Okay, Claudia.
Yeah, so our group talked about a couple important points, one of it being the critical roles of teachers, and how the sort of lack of female teachers in this context comes with a lot of structural reasons, and how in order to improve female participation in the education system, we need to think of a lot of these structural sort of barriers that are in place. We also talked a little bit about the intersectionality between being a girl, being poor, and also in rural settings, and how when thinking of policies, there's a need to remind us of that intersection and also the nuances of a particular context. And last but not least, we talked a little bit about, sort of how can we best have more support for our teachers, especially the engagement between urban areas and also rural areas, and if there's room for collaboration and partnerships, while recognizing there's a lot of richness that come from the local community, but that there are resources to be shared, and that, you know, collaboration with urban and rural settings might also benefit both parties.
Sorry. Thank you, Claudia. That was a really great summary. I'm not going to do what I did before, which is repeat everything you already said, but we'll just pick up on one piece, which is around this sort of structural, the structural causes for some of what we're seeing the symptoms of today. And I think, you know, for all of our scholars this year, that was in their research as well, is sort of how do we both tackle the symptoms of that to make sure that you know, we're ensuring the well-being of children today, but also to take that structural view and really do that work of deconstructing and reconstructing some of the systems and structures that have led to the exclusion that we're seeing today. Group number one, Hina, I think you were facilitating this group. Do you have a rapporteur, someone who's going to speak out?
Yeah, in line with my past tradition, we never got to the report nomination. We were still discussing questions arising from the presentation, and there was a lot of question on aspirations and then ideologies of parents when it comes to the education of their daughters versus sons. And the conclusion is, again, that they're interested. The aspirations piece will only shift if those role models or economic opportunities or safety and mobility conditions can be ensured for their daughters.
Thank you. Thank you, Hina. Thank you, Group One. Thank you again, Salman. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We're coming to the end of this conversation, to the end of our symposium of 2022. It's really been a series of 3 days of really rich conversations and critical conversations to the field of education, to the field of international development. We're so glad that you all were able to join us and participate, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. I just want to let you know that we will be sharing out the recording from this session as well as the other sessions, so you should be receiving that in the coming days by email. It will also be on our events page. We'll also be sharing out the scholars' policy briefs in the coming weeks, so you'll be able to read the complete research of Hina and our other 2022 Echidna Global Scholars. Please spread the word about the 2023 fellowship. And if you could help us to evaluate, we will put a link in the chat that goes to a very short evaluation, should just take a minute or two, but that will help us to continue to improve these types of experiences and you know, learning opportunities together. And it just would invite everyone to continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag Echidna Scholars. Hina, thank you again to you. Salman, thank you again to you and to everyone. Have a great day.